The whisper started before the plane even landed. She wasn't flying to mourn, she was flying to be seen. By the time the black cars lined the narrow cobblestone streets outside the private cathedral, the world's most powerful fashion figures had already slipped quietly through the doors. No red carpet, no flashing lights, just grief, legacy, and decades of real relationships walking inside in silence. And then there was her. The former royal turned streaming service personality turned professional relevance chaser had allegedly been working the phones for 48 straight hours trying to secure an invitation to a funeral she had no business attending. This wasn't a premiere. This wasn't a gala. This was a memorial for a legendary designer whose inner circle spanned half a century. And somehow she reportedly saw it as a networking opportunity with better lighting. Insiders would later say the outreach was relentless. Not a direct call, of course. That would be too obvious. Instead, intermediaries, stylists who knew assistants who once worked with someone who had been to a fitting in Milan 15 years ago. The message was delicately phrased but unmistakable. She would be in Europe. She would love to pay her respects. She would be available, as if grief were a brand partnership waiting to happen. Now let's be brutally honest about the guest list inside that cathedral. These were not casual acquaintances who wore a gown once and called it history. These were muses, collaborators, women who built entire eras of their public image draped in that designer's vision, actresses who wore his creations during career-defining moments, editors who championed him when others doubted, friends who spent holidays together when cameras weren't invited. Their tears were real. Their loss was personal. Her connection? A few red carpet appearances and borrowed couture that was returned before the dry cleaning bill cleared. And in the fashion world, that translates to exactly nothing. One industry veteran reportedly laughed when asked about the alleged attempt. Wearing the dress doesn't mean you knew the man, they said. That's not how this works. Gatekeepers, we're told, handled it swiftly, quietly, firmly. This was a private ceremony. Attendance was limited. The message was received, even if not gracefully. But what stunned insiders wasn't just the audacity, it was the timing. Because while she was allegedly maneuvering for a seat in Rome, thousands of miles away, her own estranged family member was reportedly dealing with another health scare. Public pleas for reconciliation had been floating in headlines for months. Letters unanswered, calls unreturned, invitations declined. Yet suddenly, for a designer she barely knew, the schedule was flexible. The jet was ready. The calendar cleared like magic. That contrast? It did not go unnoticed. One former palace correspondent muttered, "Fame gets a passport. Family gets voicemail." And if the funeral attempt raised eyebrows, what happened next made Hollywood choke on its green juice. Because while Europe was closing its doors, Park City was opening theirs. Sundance, snow, indie films, and an audience famous for spotting authenticity from a mile away, or in this case, the lack of it. The documentary tied to the couple's production deal was set to premiere in one of the festival's mid-sized theaters. Respectable slot, decent buzz, industry curiosity. But when the lights dimmed, rows of empty seats stared back like silent critics. At Sundance, a festival where people line up in freezing temperatures for a chance at standby admission, staff reportedly scrambled. Volunteers were sent to lounges. Attendees were gently nudged. Free seats available, they whispered like it was a clearance sale. Warm bodies were recruited to plug the visual disaster unfolding inside that theater. Even after the last-minute seat-filling operation, witnesses say entire patches of chairs remained stubbornly unoccupied. The optics were brutal. A project backed by globally known names couldn't pack a room at an event where documentaries about mushroom farming usually sell out. One festival regular put it bluntly, "If Sundance doesn't show up for you, it's because they don't believe you're real." And here's where it gets worse. According to multiple insiders, the couple hadn't even properly screened the final cut before attaching their names as producers. They showed up at the premiere discovering the film at the same time as everyone else, which is how they allegedly learned it included themes that could ruffle feathers with a very wholesome, very powerful national youth organization. You could almost see the PR team aging in real time, because now it wasn't just a lukewarm reception, it was potential backlash. The kind involving parents, donors, and institutions that do not enjoy being accidentally exposed in indie documentaries. One executive reportedly muttered, "This is what happens when you chase credits instead of content." Behind the scenes, things only got stranger. Staff were allegedly handed a list of preferred forms of address for her, titles that belonged to a life she publicly claimed had suffocated her. Formalities she once said she fled for freedom. Yet here they were again, floating through festival corridors like a ghost of royalty past, apparently demanding the very protocol she once said nearly broke her. Meanwhile, her husband drifted through events like background furniture. Smiling, nodding, silent. Observers described him as present but not participating, a supporting character in a production that increasingly had only one lead. And then there were the cameras. Footage began circulating among attendees of her hovering near panel discussions she wasn't part of, subtly positioning herself at frame edges, leaning just enough to be visible, adjusting posture when lenses turned her way. A masterclass in accidental visibility that fooled absolutely no one. It was like watching someone chase a spotlight that wasn't plugged in, one attendee whispered. But perhaps the most delicate topic of all was strictly off limits: her daughter's surprising credit in a previous project. A professional role typically earned after years of training had somehow landed on a toddler's arsum, and festival handlers were reportedly warned that questions about it were forbidden territory. Have the publicity, ban the scrutiny. A strategy so transparent, even sympathetic reporters were said to be exhausted navigating it. And as the snow fell outside Sundance theaters, inside Hollywood offices, a colder realization was settling in. This wasn't a rough patch. This was a pattern. By the time the festival wrapped, the damage wasn't just whispered, it was itemized. Studios keep quiet lists. Streamers keep quieter ones. And somewhere in a glass office overlooking Los Angeles, a row of executives had quietly moved the couple's name from high risk to financially radioactive. Because here's the thing about Hollywood that outsiders never understand. Forgiveness is cheap, but embarrassment is expensive. And this pair had just made several very powerful companies look foolish. The funeral maneuver in Europe had already circulated through fashion circles like a cautionary tale. The half-empty screening in Utah became industry folklore overnight. But what really rattled decision-makers was what insiders started calling the pattern of attachment. They didn't build projects. They attached themselves to them. Documentaries, podcasts, lifestyle shows, charity panels, keynote appearances, they drifted toward existing platforms like satellites looking for gravity. Their names were supposed to elevate everything. Instead, the reverse kept happening. The association brought noise, controversy, and a very specific kind of exhausting attention that publicists privately call oxygen theft. Every story became about them. Every launch became a personality spectacle. Every event turned into a silent negotiation over control, credit, and camera angles. One producer who had briefly considered a development deal summed it up in a single sentence: you don't get partners, you get a weather system. And storms, as investors know, are bad for business. Back in California, their public relations team was reportedly in full crisis mode. Emergency calls, strategy decks, reputation audits. The problem? There was no single fire to put out. The entire forest was smoldering. Fashion insiders felt used. Film insiders felt misled. Charity circles felt leveraged. Media outlets felt manipulated. And the public, the audience that once fueled their ascent, had begun responding with something far worse than outrage: indifference. Because scandals can trend. Outrage can be monetized. But when people stop caring entirely, the spotlight doesn't dim, it moves on. Meanwhile, inside their carefully curated mansion, a new plan was allegedly forming: reinvention. Again, the word floated around like incense at a wellness retreat. The strategy was familiar: a return to authenticity, less glam, more substance, fewer red carpets, more impact-driven storytelling, the kind of phrases that test well in branding meetings and collapse instantly in the real world. Because authenticity cannot be announced like a product launch. It has to be recognized, and recognition requires trust, something they had burned through at a rate that impressed even veteran crisis managers. Former collaborators had grown wary. Invitations slowed, then stopped. Calls began going to voicemail. The entertainment industry is famous for fake friendliness, but even that has limits. At a certain point, self-preservation kicks in. One studio executive reportedly joked, "If they ask to collaborate, I'm suddenly on vacation." The streaming world, once their golden ticket, had also cooled dramatically. Their previous deal had come with headlines, fanfare, and a 9-figure number that made everyone else in Hollywood blink twice. Now, development rooms went quiet when their names came up. Not because they were controversial, because they were unproductive. Executives can handle drama. They cannot justify budgets that don't turn into content, meetings that don't turn into scripts, announcements that don't turn into audiences. A brand built on visibility had become synonymous with vapor. And yet, in a twist no one saw coming, the final blow of the season didn't come from Hollywood or fashion or media. It came from a small bakery. Years earlier, during a globally televised wedding that felt like a fairy tale dipped in gold, an independent baker had been chosen to create a lemon elderflower cake that became instantly iconic. Photos of the delicateers circled the world. Her business exploded overnight. Interviews, cookbooks, bookings. For a while, she was the wedding baker. But time passed. Trends shifted. Costs rose. And quietly, her business began to struggle under the weight of rising rents, supply chain chaos, and the brutal economics that crush small creative businesses every year. When she launched a modest crowdfunding campaign to keep her bakery afloat and protect her employees' jobs, supporters rallied. Loyal customers donated. Local press picked up the story. And inevitably, someone asked the obvious question. Would the famous couple she once baked for step in? It should have been an easy moment, a graceful gesture, a supportive post, a donation that to them would equal the cost of a single designer jacket. Instead, there was silence. Days passed. Then a week. Online, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The couple who spoke often about compassion, community, and lifting others up seemed absent when someone directly tied to their own history needed help. It wasn't just about money, it was about acknowledgement. Gratitude has no price tag. The silence echoed louder than any statement could have. Industry observers began using a phrase that stuck: transactional humanity. The idea that relationships existed only when the cameras did. Fair or not, perception in public life becomes reality fast. And reality was shifting. The couple who once positioned themselves as modern, relatable figures challenging an outdated institution now looked increasingly like relics of a celebrity era the public had outgrown. Performative vulnerability, branded sincerity, carefully staged normalcy. Audiences had become savvier. They could smell orchestration from miles away. And so the reinvention meetings continued. New advisors, new angles, new pitches about documentaries that would change the conversation, and initiatives that would reshape narratives. But behind every polished proposal hovered the same unspoken question investors were too polite to ask directly: why would this time be different? Because the funeral attempt showed hunger for status. The festival flop showed lack of pull. The unchecked credits showed lack of oversight. The title demands showed lack of self-awareness. The bakery silence showed lack of loyalty. Individually, each incident might have been survivable. Together, they formed a portrait. And in Hollywood, where reputation is currency, that portrait was starting to look like a bad investment. Still, if there's one thing this couple had never lacked, it was belief in their own narrative. They had defied expectations before. They had survived media storms, public backlash, institutional fallout, but this storm was different because it wasn't loud. It was quiet. No dramatic takedown. No explosive scandal. Just a slow closing of doors, one polite decline at a time. And somewhere in a town built on illusion, the most dangerous thing of all had happened. People had stopped pretending. People had stopped pretending. People had stopped pretending. People had stopped